We are the country of immigrants, of opportunities.
See Tejanos, like Mexican Americans elsewhere, giving a great deal of importance to the electoral strategy.
That we hadn't paid attention to the poor, that we hadn't paid attention to minorities.
We have elevated the representation of minorities.
As minorities, as Mexican Americans, we were very few. But we were a new group coming in.
We're here now in numbers.
The public good to me is to make sure that that little Chicanito that I see sitting in third grade is going to have every opportunity to be successful.
Today, it takes 76 votes to pass a bill in the Texas House of Representatives. And with 43 members currently in the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, this caucus has the kind of influence which clearly makes it a force to be reckoned with. This influence has been steadily growing over the last 4 decades, ever since Mexican American legislators attained a critical mass in the 1960s, when the legislature gained 10 Mexican American members in the 60th legislature. The caucus was formally established in 1973, although Mexican American legislators had been meeting informally to discuss their mutual interests as early as the 1960s. The Mexican American House Caucus was organized to represent majority Mexican American constituencies. This House Caucus has been able, through its collective leadership, to advance not only the concerns of Tejanos, but of non-Latinos as well, across the state of Texas. These needs included drafting legislation that would provide education, legal defense for the indigent, health care for the indigent, workers' compensation for farm workers, the regulation of pesticides, health insurance for children, as well as setting a minimum wage and fostering economic development. In what follows, you will see and hear many current and former members of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. It will become clear that they have had and continue to have a clear vision of where Texas needs to go. As they see it, education is the key to the future. And unless Texas provides the best education for all residents, then there is a danger of jeopardizing the well-being of all Texans. Beginning at independence in 1821, Texas Mexicans worked hard to bring economic development and local rule to Texas. These efforts included promoting Anglo-American immigration, which created increasing political conflict with national authorities in Mexico City and the state capital of Coahuila. Although Tejanos participated in the struggle for independence, they quickly found themselves politically and economically marginalized.
It was a very difficult time for Mexican Americans during this period because they had conflicted loyalties. Their first loyalty, of course, was to their patria chica, which is, of course, Texas. And then secondly, the Federalist government of Mexico at the time. Now, in 1834, when Santa Anna changed to a centralist government, many of the Mexicans in Texas became very concerned about the change from a Federalist states' rights point of view to a centralist kind of government. And that was when they began to separate from the government of Mexico and began to think in terms of creating their own space and trying to retain states' rights.
Many Tejanos, such as Juan Seguin, saw their political and economic interests linked to those of the Texians and participated in the Texas War of Independence.
There was representation. The first person who represented Tejanos in the Republican Congress, the Congress of the Republic of Texas, was a man by the name of Jose Antonio Navarro from San Antonio. He was followed by others from South Texas and San Antonio. The representation was very limited. There was no time that more than one person, one Tejano, represented the entire Tejano population. But Jose Antonio Navarro, a man by the name of Jose Ruiz, and Lorenzo de Zavala had signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. One of the things that happens during the period of the Texas Revolution and the war between Mexico and the U.S., roughly the 1830s and the 1840s, is that there's a major transfer of land and business ownership away from Mexican hands, so that the the economic base of the Tejano population is devastated. There is no economic base to support large-scale political activity that could result in the election of people Tejanos to political office beyond the local areas. The representation of Tejanos in the legislature from 1846, when Texas becomes a part of the Union, and say 1900, is very limited.
In the early 1900s, though, an important figure entered the political arena on behalf of Texas Mexicans, signaling the beginnings of a movement that would come to fruition in the 1960s as the Civil Rights Movement.
The person who emerges in the early 1900s is a very interesting individual, J.T. Canales, Jose Tomas Canales from Brownsville. He is particularly known for chairing a committee in the legislature that investigated charges of corruption and violence by the Texas Rangers.
Following Canales, the only Tejanos to serve were Arnold Valle and Agustin Celaya until after World War II, when organizations like LULAC and the GI Forum began to advocate for greater political participation.
And that is basically the beginning of what we call the Civil Rights Movement. And within the Civil Rights Movement, that has its beginnings around the 1920s and the 1930s, that we see Tejanos, like Mexican Americans elsewhere, giving a great deal of importance to the electoral strategy as a way to create changes for the Mexican origin population. And the organization that emerges as the prominent organization that leads the civil rights efforts is the League of United Latin American Citizens. The American GI Forum appears later. It appears after the Second World War in the 1940s. And it appears as an organization of veteran Mexican Americans and their supporters, including family members, who began to use their contributions at the battlefield and their veteran status as a way to pry openings for the Mexican American community socially, economically, and politically.
These groups would use 3 strategies to increase the participation of Texas Mexicans in the electoral process and ultimately increase their representation in the state legislature.
One of the strategies that they use is they go to the public. They go to the bar of public opinion and call on good moral people to join in this effort to eradicate discrimination and segregation, much like African Americans are doing in other parts of the country. The other strategy is a litigation strategy. They not only go to the bar of public opinion, but they also take legal action using their constitutional guarantees to challenge discrimination, particularly in the schools, in part because they believe that the future lies, of course, in the young generation. To the extent that the younger folks are able to get educated, the chances of improving the condition of the Mexican American community increases significantly. The third strategy that they use, the civil rights activists, is the electoral strategy. And the electoral strategy becomes increasingly important as the demographics change, that is, as the Mexican American population grows and as the numbers of voters, Tejano voters, increases, the electoral strategy becomes even more important in seeking change.
While these strategies were effective, the registration fee imposed on voters, known as the poll tax, still had an adverse effect by stopping many Texas Mexicans from exercising the right to vote.
The poll tax was a major deterrent, and it basically requires that people pay some money, they pay an amount, in order to be able to participate in the electoral process as voters. And the poll tax was passed initially basically to reform the electoral process, basically to address problems of corruption. They wanted the electoral process to be more held accountable, so the legislators passed the poll tax. It was also passed in part to control the African American and Mexican American vote. That is, by requiring a prohibitive amount of money, the idea was that they could then minimize the participation of African American and Mexican American voters. And it had that effect.
As the 1960s began, with the election of John F. Kennedy as president, a mindset of change began taking place. World War II veterans, like former state representative Joe Bernal, recalled the mood of the times when he entered the state legislature in 1964.
There seemed to be, from my way of thinking, a feeling that we could undo a lot of bad things that had happened in our country, that we hadn't paid attention to the poor, that we hadn't paid attention to minorities, and that something had to be done. And of course, there were some very strong things occurring, especially in the black community when they were burning cities and so on. The whole thing came from having served Chicanos and blacks and other white folks that had served in World War II came back. At least minorities came back with a very changed opinion about keeping America the way it was before they went to World War II. So there was a mindset there of change, that we weren't going to, that our civil rights needed to be protected, and we were going to fight for it. We weren't going to wait and be handed that protection, but that the fight had to occur.
Ironically, the important turning point for Mexican Americans, given the state's history of discrimination and segregation and marginalization, is actually when there's a Texan in the White House. It's all the civil rights legislation that's passed during Lyndon Johnson's administration.
The rise of Lyndon B. Johnson to the White House after Kennedy's assassination imbued the times with even more energy for change.
And the one who followed President Kennedy, of course, our own LBJ turned out to be one of the biggest progressives that this country had ever produced. He wasn't that type of a person when he was a congressman and then a senator out of Texas. He was somewhat conservative. But being president, he helped continue and create the changes that occurred in the mid-60s.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American.
The Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965.
The Voting Rights Act, Higher Education Act, series of measures that are intended to foster the participation of minorities in national civil society. So I really have to point to the early 1960s and to what's going on in Washington, D.C. as having the most impact for political participation of Mexican Americans in Texas.
These federal laws had to be coordinated with state laws, and it often fell on the few Mexican Americans in the Texas legislature to do this important work. Laws enforcing racial segregation, for instance, had to be expunged.
Well, for one, on the voting, I had the resolution that for Texas to comply with the national lowering of the voting age nationally, because some states had already lowered the voting age to 18. And I thought that's really going to be something good for the state of Texas. So I carried that.
In the 1960s and 70s, however, the obstacles that Mexican Americans had to overcome to get elected were extreme. After winning a legislative seat, their efforts to effect positive changes for their Mexican American constituencies were met with almost insurmountable resistance.
Well, of course, one of the greatest challenges was the fact that we had terrible attitudes in Houston. There had not been a Hispanic elected to public office in over 130 years since Lorenzo de Zavala served as the first vice president of the Republic. And so we had to overcome those attitudes. And the next thing we had to do is come and serve in the House where, again, they had never seen a person from a metropolitan district with a Hispanic name.
The new members of the legislature faced a steep learning curve.
You have to talk to the members who are not of the persuasion that you are in terms of what you believe in, but there were other factors involved. I mean, the factors that were involved is you have to remember these people also represented districts, and they could only go so far based on the fact that they had to get reelected. And so you had to find ways to establish the rapport between you and individual members.
Efforts to improve the lives of Texans across the board by passing the minimum wage bill, though, were still met with resistance.
It took me 2 sessions to pass the minimum wage bill. And that's because, again, you're talking to people who represented areas like Dallas, who represented their areas like Fort Worth, and all of the conservative areas. And so you had to persuade them that this was not the end of the world, that this was simply trying to get a wage so that people could live with dignity.
Teaming up with others with similar interests thus became key to passing legislation which could improve the lives of Texans across the state, regardless of their ethnicity.
What I found was that in the Texas legislature, we had a lot of people that had of German background, Czech background, and other background, white Europeans, that their grandparents were suffering the same thing. They couldn't get old age pensions because they were from the old country. So lo and behold, I ended up with a constitutional amendment that, one, it had to be passed by both houses. I was a House member at that time, by 2/3 vote, to provide for old age assistance through the state of Texas, but it was federal money.
But on issues of particular interest to Mexican Americans, such as expanding higher education in South Texas, Bernal and others came up against the powers that be from other parts of the state.
What I found out by that was that the politics in Houston and the politics in Dallas, with the money that they can put together for legislators, especially those that were running for statewide offices, made a lot of difference in who gets the benefits of the state. There was a lot of very horrible feelings about the fact that they were coming out about why we shouldn't have universities, public universities in San Antonio. The mindset there was San Antonio was a cheap labor town, and South Texas was a cheap labor whatever, whether you went to Corpus or Laredo or wherever you went in South Texas. But in San Antonio, we were a cheap labor town, and a lot of people wanted to keep it a cheap labor town. And of course, if you educated the masses in San Antonio, they might start demanding a little more salary for the work that they were doing. And that came into it wasn't talked about because you don't talk about racism and prejudice openly, but that to me was part of it.
The hard lessons learned from this experience were eye-opening and caused Bernal and others to create the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. The caucus would act as a think tank to bring professional research tools legislators could use to pass much-needed legislation.
One of the things that as a legislator, I would reach out for wherever I could find research on things that I was dealing with legislatively. And if they weren't tied into something that was happening nationally or other states, I would have a hard time. We were just short good researchers that were of that progressive mind, to change things after World War II and to make things happen. So a lot of it, you just did a lot of legwork, going desk to desk and explaining to people what you were doing and that you wanted their vote.
When it comes to educational policymaking, obtaining consensus among legislators is possible only after educating them about the importance of education to our state's future, especially over issues with which many of them are simply unfamiliar.
Well, first of all, I believe that education is one of the major obstacles that we are facing right now, simply because we don't have enough legislators who understand the education system. For example, I doubt that any legislators, or a great majority of them, have ever spent a couple of weeks, 2 weeks, in an educational environment, so that they have to go simply by testimony, and that's not enough.
The failure to equitably fund schools across Texas in the past is evidenced by the high dropout rates among Mexican Americans today. This is certain to have long-lasting results.
If you don't educate the minority element in this state, we're going to be not unlike a third world country. in the state of Texas because you either pay right now or you pay later. I said, when these people become non-productive in their better years of their life, you're going to be in an aging group. You're going to be at an aging group that's going to be demanding support from that element that you didn't train back there, and they're not really providing the kinds of work and the kinds of job and the kinds of money being drawn into the state to be able to provide for your old age.
So as the era of changes inspired by the civil rights movement extended into the 1970s, consensus building becomes an even more important goal for the few members of what would eventually become a more integrated and better coordinated Mexican-American Legislative Caucus. Its formal creation, though, would not happen until a bigger critical mass of Mexican-American state representatives succeeded in winning entry into the legislature.
As minorities, as Mexican-Americans, we were very few, but we were a new group coming in.
For the few pioneering Texas Mexican House representatives in the legislature, the late 1960s and early 1970s brought the beginnings of creating much-needed changes. The legislators in office at this time would become the ones who would initiate the process of formally organizing the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus. These Texas Mexican legislators would begin the process of studying and working to create the equitable funding of public schools and the development of infrastructure for state universities in South Texas. Other important social and educational concerns had to be addressed as well.
Single-member district is what made Texas so powerful as far as minorities is concerned, as far as blacks and Chicanos, Mexican-Americans, whatever we are. What we have done is that we have elevated the representation of minorities here.
A major challenge, which also had to be overcome, was the racial discrimination against Mexican Americans, which came in several different forms.
Challenges for me, having run because primarily I saw sectors of society who were not being treated fairly or justly. I myself have gone to segregated schools. In the little town where I grew up, there were 3 schools, one for blacks, one for Mexicans, and one for whites. The issue of discrimination in employment, in college attendance, in women's rights, in basically the people who were less fortunate and couldn't fight for themselves is why I ran.
The funding of public education has been one of our greatest fights in the legislature. And just the recognition that Mexican-American is an American. Mexican-American is hyphenated, and I hate that. But they recognize and they know that we have become a very powerful force in this state and this country.
To overcome the effects of poverty and a lack of economic opportunity, which were often the result of racial discrimination, important legislation had to be passed in a variety of areas that were deemed crucial to improving the lives of Texas Mexicans.
I remember very well the key issues that we had when I was first elected had to do with bilingual education. We had an 80% dropout rate among Spanish-speaking children in Texas, and the response to that, at least one of the responses, not the total response, was that we needed to repeal the prohibition against bilingual education, against teaching in any other language except English. And throughout my 34 years in the legislature, I was the key sponsor of bilingual education. And I worked with when I went to the Senate, with the late Representative Matt Garcia from San Antonio, from Bexar County. And we carried the bill through during the time that the former federal judge, William Wayne Justice, issued an order mandating bilingual education from K through the 12th grade. And we had to respond to that with legislation. And I remember Matt Garcia being an outstanding attorney, and I introduced in the legislation that would complement the judge's order.
At that time, to help address this pressing dropout problem, Duran also promoted legislation to create GED programs with the Adult Education Act.
Early in my career, I found a need for another major piece of legislation that the Caucus supported, and that was the Texas Adult Education Act. And that was the act that would allow more people to get their GEDs and be able to show that they had a high school education. And at that time, we only had the program going through the 6th grade, and it only involved federal funds. We didn't have state funds. There was really no support for adult education, even though the 80% dropout rate had become the adults, the breadwinners, the fathers and mothers, and we were not providing assistance to them.
In addition to these much-needed educational programs, Duran promoted the Housing Authority Act. He brought the food stamp federal program to Texas, as well as the school breakfast program. He also helped to establish the Texas Human Rights Commission. Aiding the members of the fledgling Mexican-American Legislative Caucus was LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
The LULAC Higher Education Service Center in Corpus Christi that came to me and said we're having trouble with our student loan programs. And we were able to pass the Guaranteed Student Loan Program of Texas, which has been a very, very successful program. Close to $14 billion in loan values in the state of Texas. Hundreds and thousands of students have used this program. Extremely successful. 3 things as an educator that we look at: distance, the testing barriers, the distant barriers, and the wealth and the health. I mean, the ability to pay for college, the cost. LULAC, when they filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas for not providing institutions of higher learning in South Texas, sort of eliminated the distant barrier. My bill kind of eliminated the cost barrier. And finally, Irma Rangel's bill that allows students to go, the top 10%, to go into our university system without being tested. And Irma finally completed that the triad, eliminated the testing in a sense. And so the doors open, wide open, and you're going to see South Texas developed a lot quicker, economically.
The equitable funding of public school education would remain a top priority, but it would take years before solutions could be passed as legislation. The Mexican-American Legislative Caucus in the next decade would play a central role in effecting these solutions. The end of the 1970s are marked by 2 important developments to the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus. The first major development is redistricting, with the reapportionment of districts with new legislative positions.
First of all, we have to recognize that there was a tremendous sea change in the legislature as a result of redistricting, which brought Mexican Americans into the legislature and secured for the very first time appropriate proportional representation of Mexican Americans in the legislature. Without the case that forced the Texas legislature to reapportion itself, the Senate and the House, we would not have had a Mexican American Legislative Caucus.
The second major development occurred during the summer of 1978, when House Speaker Billy Clayton called a meeting in Bandera, Texas.
It happened in the summer of 1978, but it was as a recognition of the newfound power of Mexican American legislators as a result of redistricting. And therefore, in an effort to gain a consensus on any given issue, it was necessary for the Speaker to be able to garner support from not just the Mexican American caucus, but from the Black caucus as well.
Despite this newfound power, the Mexican American legislators still face many challenges in passing legislation for their constituencies.
One of the key groups at that time was the Mexican American Caucus. We have very few Hispanics in positions of power, very few Hispanics who were chairing committees. We had a rule that only one bill could be allowed to come to the House floor. You had to set a priority bill. It was very much a controlled environment.
But now, for the first time, the Mexican American Legislative Caucus had gained the critical numbers to negotiate its interests in a number of areas beyond bilingual education and civil rights.
In my first term in Austin, and that was in 1983, I was part of one of the largest groups of new reps that showed up. There were about over 40 new representatives that came out of the redistricting.
We organized the caucus into probably one of the most effective groups that made social change in the state of Texas possible. Instead of focusing only on bilingual education, only on civil rights, we spread ourselves and took up the challenge of being educated and doing research on banking, agriculture, oil and gas, economic development, higher education, public education, all across the board, that we were able to debate on any issue on the Senate, on the House floor, that allow us to gain credibility and use the media to bring out these issues and educate the public as to what was going on in the Texas House. So the challenge was to educate the public and change the system, which I thought we were effective in doing at that time.
Members of the Mexican American House Caucus then took on several issues that came to reshape not only their districts, but also the state of Texas.
Other legislation created the free trade zone in the port of Corpus Christi, where people could bring in goods to the port and not tax it. It would not be taxable until it left the port, whether it was assembled there as a product or something like that. Created the transit authority in Corpus Christi to start a mass transit, and the buses and so forth in Corpus. So it was education, economic development issues that basically faced the whole state.
In the early 1980s, Senator Hector Uribe and I carried enterprise legislation that provided for tax abatements and tax credits to companies that would relocate in areas of high unemployment, in areas of poverty. We also passed legislation dealing with indigent health care. If you recall, Mark White was governor at that time, and we're trying to find a way to provide health care to the indigent across the board. And the way we did that was by requiring counties to allocate 10% of their budget for indigent health care. And we lost the bill during the end of the session. I remember having a press conference with the caucus at 1 o'clock in the morning, criticizing Governor White for allowing that bill to die, because he was filibustered at the end. And immediately he called a special session, and we got it passed to provide health care for the poorest of the poor in our state.
Beyond taking care of statewide needs, legislators responded to the lack of infrastructure in many South Texas communities.
In my legislative efforts, I have tried to work on the problem of the colonias. I'd introduced bills to try to stop the proliferation of new colonias so that nobody would be profiting from putting in these substandard developments. Okay, I think that's a crime. Should be a crime. It is now. It wasn't back when I started, but little by little we put in requirements so that it became very difficult to do these substandard subdivisions. And then in 1989, I was the House sponsor of the Colonia Bill, which provided $500 million of grants to put in water and sewer into all of these colonias along the border areas. And it's been 15 years since that happened, but it's had a tremendous impact in our area.
There was some legislation that had been brought in for 2 sessions, and I took it on the 3rd session, and it was an issue dealing with tax revenue bonds. For counties can issue tax revenue bonds, and that's a way to finance, projects for colonias. Exactly, because it's very expensive to dealing with colonias and getting those things fixed. And so I passed that out of the House. The bill passed. The bill passed, and now it's up to the counties to use it.
Irma represented a district that, for the most part, had a lot of poverty in it. Places like Stark County, where there's 50% unemployment. She did a lot in the ways of accessing money to send back to Stark County for roads. And to this day, they credit Irma Rangel for the road system that they have in Stark County. She passed bills, welfare to work bills, work training bills for women to get them off welfare into training.
As the newly empowered caucus began to flex its muscle, issues related to education became central at the public school and university level, with many of these issues remaining important today. Federal court rulings mandated that all children, regardless of immigrant status, be educated. To provide equitable funding of public schools, the caucus understood that it had to work to change the archaic funding formulas for public education.
Gosh, when I first went to the legislature in 1981, the first bill that I introduced as a state representative was a bill that repealed the state law that said that the children of undocumented workers had to pay tuition. Because that law was still on the books, it was being challenged in the courts. But at the time that I arrived at the legislature, it was still law. We had a number of those kids here in Houston, and there were a number of kids around the state that the state was requiring that they pay tuition. I passed it in the House. I could not pass it in the Senate, but it later became, the Supreme Court ruled on it and struck down the law. And I bring that up because I think it's interesting in light of what's going on today.
We made dramatic changes to the education system, completely threw the old formula out and passed a new formula based on the children that you had, which is the logical way of funding it, right? And in that formula, that provided money so that even if you didn't have a classroom, you could build temporary classrooms, you could use other things, and still have money to hire teachers to put them in. And then we mandated smaller class size in the early grades, the 22-to-1 limit for grades from pre-kinder all the way to fourth grade, I think it was. And that made a tremendous difference in terms of what kids are able to learn, okay? Later on, we worked on formulas that provided money for funding of buildings, and those things have made a difference over time.
We ended up merging the Pan American with the University of Texas system. After we did that, we set up a regional system where we merged a lot of the universities with UT and Pan American to provide more resources.
Unlike other parts of the state, our area did not have had very few master's programs and had no doctoral programs. In fact, I think there was only one doctoral program south of San Antonio. That was one in Kingsville. So there was efforts made to try to correct that.
In the merger with A&M, it was not just the Corpus campus. The legislation that we had brought A&M campus to Kingsville, Laredo in South Texas, and also brought the University of Texas to Edinburgh, the Pan American, and Brownsville. So we had to work a consensus of the South Texas legislators, everybody to agree what would go where, when, why, and cross the T's and dot the I's. So it took a consensus not only of the South Texas legislatures, the South Texas leadership, mayors, county commissioners, judges, etc., that worked together. It was one of the few times in history that people in South Texas politically have gotten together on one issue and worked out a benefit for all.
And I think they began to at least think of our education system as a resource for diversifying our economy.
As their numbers grew, Mexican-American Legislative Caucus members continued expanding their legislative interests in the 1990s and into the 21st century.
Well, it's a little over 30 years old now, 32. And it has had a major impact on legislation, and I think a major impact on the Latino community, simply because we're here now in numbers. To pass a bill in the Texas House of Representatives requires 76 votes. And the Mexican-American Caucus now has 43 members. So if you can get the caucus, you're already more than half the way to getting a majority for your issue. So it provides a great base from which to build a coalition for passing legislation, and it's always been very good at articulating the needs and the desires of the Latino community in Texas.
I was very, very proud that a lot of my healthcare expertise, and particularly working in the barrio, owning my own pharmacy and working in an area of town where healthcare access can sometimes be very difficult, helped me to take a public health message to the legislature. So some of the very first legislation that I did was a program that they call it the Texas Two-Step, or all shots by two, knowing that it was very important to have immunization for our children. That's one of the reasons I ran for the legislature. Children's health care when it came to things like lead registry, birth defects, all the safety legislation as regards to bicycle helmets and the car seats and the regulations for that. But probably the thing one of the proudest moments for me in children's health care was the establishment of our children's health care insurance program. And so I was very, very proud to be one of the lead sponsors of that legislation.
Lack of education, lack of access to health care. I've been working on those two issues, especially for the last 3.5 years. Probably a third of the people in my district don't have health insurance. So that's one of the things that I've been working on in the legislature.
The bill that I filed and worked very hard to pass is the bill relating to diabetes. Children, as we know, there are growing numbers that indicate that more and more children, and especially Hispanic children, are contracting diabetes early on.
Moving toward the 21st century, the caucus has been engaging a broad range of social and economic issues. For example,
well, specifically, the most notable is House Bill 1403, which is legislation that allowed for those immigrant students that have been in Texas for a long period of time to attend state universities, paying in-state tuition rates and not having to pay international rates. That has resulted in over 10,000 students in the state of Texas that have now accessed Texas colleges and schools.
Those type of things are what we're going to have to continue to provide so these students can continue to go to school and so they and their parents can feel that education will be and is the greatest equalizer for our children.
During the 1990s, more Mexican American women entered the legislature than ever before, and they brought their own unique talents to the legislative process. As new legislators, they had challenges, but Irma Rangel, the first Mexican American female legislator, elected to the House in 1976, became a mentor for others.
Irma was a woman of firsts. She was first at everything. She was the first Hispanic woman elected to the legislature. She was the first Hispanic woman chair of House Higher Education Committee. She was, the first to get a professional school for South Texas. It goes on and on.
Irma is the madrina of not just all of the Latinas in the House. She was the madrina de todos. I think the greatest legislative challenges at the time when I came in 1901 is we had experienced, up until that time, very few women in the Texas legislature. I had some great role models there, in particular with Representative Irma Rangel. And so there were very few Latinas, but very few women.
She was a lot of fun to be with, but boy, when you needed to get down and fight hard, she was there where the slugging needed to be done,
Irma Rangel was a hell of a member, man. Very educated.
You have to do all these little things first, and Irma had been through that system. She really had, and she just kept at it, and she had just a wonderful spirit, that won people over. Later on, when she became chair of the Higher Education Committee, she was actually able to weave her magic over all of these other people, right? And in the process, help the institution which was in her home district which became Texas A&M at Kingsville.
She was an incredible leader as chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. She empowered the organization, empowered its members, consensus builder in that way.
She brought a lawyer's mind into the mix. She knew how far legislatively the opposition could go.
Irma was an incredibly ethical person, and she was an incredible person with the staff in the sense of training us to be better human beings, better policy people, a better understanding of everything. She was a woman of vision. She was a woman with a mission to help educate kids. As a school teacher, she never forgot the importance of education. And that certainly was something that her parents encouraged in her, and it just flourished. She taught school in South Texas, also taught school in California, Venezuela, which she refers to as the best years of her life, the 7 years she spent down there. She was an educator, and she wanted kids educated.
Education-related issues for Mexican-American legislators remained a top priority, as the intellectual capacity of our students is now our most important economic resource for building a strong future for Texas.
And when you talk about education, talk about financing. We've cut down, and nobody's really for higher taxes, but at the same time, you want to make sure you have strong public schools.
My number one fear is that what our state demographer, Dr. Murdoch, predicts is if we don't change that educational attainment level, then the next generation of Texans will be the first generations that will be worse off than their parents.
The challenges standing before the Texas legislature today all involve building consensus, particularly in the area of education. To achieve this goal, the demographic shift in diversity, where the majority of Texans will soon be Mexican American, has to be valued. Here's how former and current members of the Legislative House view diversity.
Undeniably, the strength of this country is the wonderful fabric of the different colors that is woven from people from Romania to China, Africa, Latin America. And the question is going to be, how can these different groups get together and work together?
I think that most of the people that come into this country come looking for a better place. Well, if you get people who are optimistic enough and intrepid enough to go looking for a better place, I think they're going to build a better place.
We are the country of immigrants, of opportunities. And unfortunately, too many people have come across the oceans from Europe and have forgotten. But I'd like to think that we have an opportunity to work together to better our state and our country. We cannot do it by discriminating against people.
I think the diversity of our state is a great asset to this state. Diversity in our country is what made our country great.
We have a young population. We have a population that's very eager and ambitious and ready to work. Texas, as compared to other states, benefits from that diversity. We benefit from our relationship with Mexico and South America through trade and cultural interaction, and I only see that improving as the years go on.
And I think that diversity is going to be, as you look at our population, the Mexicanos, is we're young, we're going to be educated, we're eager, and we love responsibility, and we're extremely loyal. And I think those four combinations together is going to be a tremendous asset for the state of Texas.
We can get anywhere that we want as a state. We've just got to have the leadership to get there, the wherewithal to get there, and we've got to be able to plan that. Success isn't built overnight. We've got to start now and work our way forward. But diversity is absolutely a key to our success.
Think of this. We're the only country in the world that will give someone the title of an educated person and they speak only one language. Nowhere else in the world would anyone be identified with that title as an educated person and be monolingual. Yet here in the United States, we frequently want to say, we just want to speak one language, when where we should be pushing is that every child that graduates from our schools should speak 2, 3 languages, much like they do in other parts of the world.
Consensus building among all sectors of society and geographic areas in Texas will increasingly be important in the future, so Texas can take the lead in education and economic development.
The issue of Texans getting along with each other is always there. We have a rich culture and heritage here in Texas.
The reality is that the legislature works on the basis of relationships. It always has. Partisanship never mattered really until recently.
We need to provide leadership at the state level, where right now it's mainly a party issue, and that just, you get nothing out of it, in my opinion.
It takes a real spirit to sit there and against all this adversity that there is, to sit there and work and work and work to pass one bill, take a small little baby step, and then take another baby step. And it's the only way you can work in the legislature. All the big things take time.
I believe higher education funding and support for the middle class is one of the single most important issues for building a majority.
And if we don't adopt the understanding that we've got to have the best schools in the world, we will have had a huge disservice. We will have had a huge disservice to future generations of the state.
Texas today stands at the crossroads of moving forward or slipping into an economic decline from which we may never be able to recover. To move forward, educating all Texans will be necessary, and to accomplish this goal, visionary leadership and consensus building shall be key. And if the past successes of the Mexican-American Legislative Caucus are any indication of where we'll be going, then the future of Texas shall indeed be bright.